Hello, shipmates. How are you? How are you? Well, meanwhile, back on this side of the planet, I don't know how many of you have been to Antarctica, but that's always an eyeful. It's like visiting a whole other place without having to bring your own water and oxygen. But I worked many years actually for Lindblad Travel down there, back when there was even more penguins, and it's remarkable how it changes, but very little. The more you're there, it's vast, but it's so sort of separate from all the other troubles in the world, hopefully. And today I'm going to talk about fishing. Gee, has anybody ever gone fishing around here? How about that lunch? They caught that all this morning. Well, almost. They caught us this morning. But I'm going to talk about fishing in Alaska, which of course is it's a big industry up here, but it's also sort of like a cultural identifier for so many of the people here because they have about 50% of Alaska's private business is actually based on fishing. And the it's under my foot. Ah, yeah, you're right. Oh, I caught another one. Thank you. There we go. Yeah, they still make this stuff. Well, the three principles of fishing are, of course, patience, persistence, and now preservation, because the stocks have been so diminished over the times. But Alaska's been called the last great wild fishery left on the planet after almost every sea you name has been depleted or is a fraction of what it used to be. But in Alaska, they have preserved enough stocks that there's still a very healthy industry, depending on which fish and which year. It's very unpredictable often. So you know the basic story of the salmons and the trouts and the halibut. These are the keystone fish that are pursued here. And they have all over Alaska, let's say, sports derbies to catch the first salmons and the biggest halibut. And for the sports fishing side, it's pretty exciting. And then for the commercial fishing side, it's a long, dreary effort, often in a very limited season. So if you look out today, it's a perfect day to go fishing. It's cold, it's wet, it's rainy, and you don't have to be too comfortable out there. Well, anyway, the fishing industry employs up to 50,000 people seasonally. And of course, mostly in the summer and in the catch season, and then with the processing and all the shipping, that's a major job. Everybody often has another job at the other time of year, but the exports alone have been about 36 billion for the state in general. That's with hundreds of millions of pink salmon or sockeye, chum, and the king salmon is the prize of the fisher, sports fishing. But the whole state is sort of divided between all these areas we've heard of over and over again, that we are in the semi-tropical, almost southeast corner. Then there's the Great Aleutian Islands, the Bering Sea, and then up into the Arctic. And each one has its contribution in the fishing and in the sport also. Mostly the main part is offshore. That's some 45% there of it caught in the Bering and in the 200-mile territorial waters. Then there's all the inland fishing. And of course, the original fish catchers were just the other species. So I don't know if you've ever seen a bear standing and nipping these things out of the air as they come in, but that's probably how humans first learned how to fish, is from other animals and then developing tools. And so the native population is particularly full of, let's say, legends and awe over this whole part of the world where there was such abundant fisheries, to the point where here's a sculpture that was in Ketchikan until recently, went to a museum of a walrus bone carving of the fisher people of the far north. This is the Yupik or the Inupiaq people up in the Arctic. But this particular view of it I caught while it was still there because it shows kind of the fear of the sea. Here they're riding on a giant squid, and the squid picks one of them up for lunch. This has been told over and over again. They used to have such larger creatures in the sea that there's stuff of legends around the world, but they say giant octopuses used to swim in and just grab people off the beach. But that was before. And And now the relationship, of course, with the people, with the sea is so essential, and so there's a ceremony that happens all through South Alaska where the salmon come in the spring, depending on the species, and so there's a they call the first salmon festival when whoever catches the first one brings it in for a ceremony ashore, and people would bathe and paint the fish with ochre and bird down, and then ceremonially cook it and give it to the elders of the community, who would then carry the bones and put it back in the sea and saying, this is the offering back, so that the fish will come in full to feed everybody. And so this is where the first salmon of the year would actually be given a name like the Chief of Spring or the Noble One or other names every year. And then the people would fish for the run, depending on the species, it comes at a different time of year, but spring until through the fall. We had some Chinook running, yeah, I think it was in Sitka. And so then there's a whole process of smoking and drying it. Usually it's the men go out fishing and then the women man the fires and smoke the fish. And so this becomes the staple for many a subsistence community. And the native peoples now have, let's say, primary right to the fishing grounds in various places, so that they're guaranteed their take. And the techniques they would use were many. Mere spears like this, and often made of bone. Before there was any metal up in this part of the world, they were crafted with very stone and hardwoods. Here's a herring rake that they used to, in a kayak or canoe, they would come, when the herring were running, they would just come and rake them up and fill their boat with them. And that was a staple for oil. And they traded it with inland tribes. So this is often called the Yulikon, or this candlefish. There are many names for it, many varieties of it actually. Then they also would go fishing for salmon, which is for sturgeon, which is now an endangered species and not allowed to be caught. But these great, sometimes 4 or 5 meter long fish would be bottom feeding up the rivers before they then would spawn, and they would use this kind of a big long hook with feathers on it so they could feel when the fish was bumping into the bait, and then they would pull it up. They also would make hooks out of bear claws and sticks, and these were subjects of some veneration because everybody would make their own hook like this, sort of like tying your own fly for fly fishing, except that these can be pretty big. And I saw one in Wrangell, which was in the local shop made by one of the local Tlingit people. And so they carve them, they paint them, they put eyes on them, they give them a name, and then they bless them, saying, go down and get that halibut. And this would be done by dropping a sinker stone with a slip knot on it, and then the baited hook would be bobbing around, sort of looking like another fish or maybe a little bird, and then boom, the halibut would jump from the bottom. It's a bottom living fish, and be caught. So you've no doubt had the Alaskan halibut. It's one of the great fish staples up here, and they're commonly caught all through southern Alaska. And so these sometimes get so big, they are quite a haul. They're not a fighting fish as much as they're just big and floppy. So there are a number of different varieties, but the biggest ones that I've seen have been off in Seward, which is a sports fishing center down on the Kenai Peninsula, where they routinely get 200 to 300 pounds, and sometimes this big. So who caught who? I'm not sure, but they're both taking a nap. And of course, the halibut it's a very lovable fish because its left eye rotates to the top of its head over the time lying flat on the bottom. So there's a mug that only another halibut would really appreciate. Well, anyway, I'll go into the sports fishing because this is the other thing. People come at great expense to go get a bush plane, fly out there into these vast inlands and fish for rainbow or steelheads. And so this is a whole different thing from the industry. This is, let's say, camping and adventure with the adventure of fly fishing. And I had a friend who was a state fisheries specialist, a scientist, and he would go out there for 6 months of the year, be dropped by a plane, him and his dog and his gun and his fishing gear, and he'd be fishing every day and monitoring the streams, and then they'd come and pick him up. And then the rest of the 6 months he would live in Hawaii. So he caught his vacation on that. But there are very serious laws about this now because they don't want to injure or diminish the stock. They don't really even need to feed the streams and lakes up here. There are already so many. But this is the ultimate sin for the fly fishing, to go snagging, which is just throw an open hook and grab whatever you can. There's often so much fish that you can just snag them like that, but that's considered not proper fishing, and so you can get if they catch you with a fish that was snagged, you get a fine and such. So they try to keep, let's say, a bit of civility out there amidst all the other catching and releasing. But the king salmon are the ones that are the great prize. So they're the largest of the salmon. They come back to spawn about every 5 years, so they grow up to 200 more pounds. And so this is what people in Sitka particularly go out there to get a boat, get a place, go out as they come in from the ocean, then they come up into the streams. But by the time they get to the streams, they're already so exhausted, they've lost a lot of their fight, and they've also started to deteriorate because then they go up the stream and die. And so here's the fun of it all. Girls fish too, and the old saw is, why do the women always catch more fish than the men on the boat? Because they're not interested in fishing. Anyway, they catch anyway. It's a sort of the beginner's luck, I guess you might call it, but there are a lot of professional women fisher, sports fisher and commercial fisher, so it's not exactly as differentiated as it used to be. Again, another beautiful king salmon. And there are a whole variety of rockfish. These are bottom-dwelling, non-migratory fishes, but they're sort of like a snapper. So there's a market for those. But here's in Seward, you have the sport fishing harbor there, and a lot of catch. They go right out into the deep ocean right there. They're not on an inner passage like we are, where it takes so long to get out to the sea. But even right there, there are a lot of other species like lingcod, black cod. These are fighting fish. This one in particular didn't really want to be aboard because you get near that, you realize it may be hungry. And cod are an odd species because they always keep swimming and they'll eat anything in front of them, including their own kin. That's why you can't farm cod, because they'll chase each other around the pen until there's only one big one left. This is a grayling, which is on menus now at its display. Here's another skillfish, which is a deep water fish that they keep finding more species, and the lines go down deeper and they keep finding more. There's some particularly beautiful fish, the pug-nosed fish. Again, this is often caught as bycatch with the other commercial fisheries, but as they go down in the ocean, they keep finding more unusual deep water sea fish, like you've seen some in some of the documentaries. There's also quite a bit of run of eel, which is not exactly a sports fish, but it is traditionally caught by the locals, because when it comes running up the rivers, just like it did in Europe and North America, East Coast it used to, they still have a very big eel run, and most of that will go to the sushi bars in Asia. And here's another grayling with a mossback, and another curious one called the lump sucker. I don't know why, but so these are not sport fish. They're just the oddities of the sea. But where we came up in the Inner Passage, this became a sort of the second gold rush of Alaska, or maybe it's the third one after the furs, the gold, and then the invention of cannery made it possible so you could catch all you wanted, put it in the cannery and pack it up, and it's preserved to be shipped around the world. And that meant there was a tremendous boom. Thousands of boats would come up from Seattle in the season, smaller ones, and then the New England fisheries came in and they started setting up the canneries and the docks and invest in it, and brought in fishermen from outside. And this started what they call the Cannery Wars up here, where they were competing companies would gather in one bay or on one island, and then they would set up weirs and they'd set up the nets, and they would claim it as their own. And this led to conflicts with the natives, who traditionally would just get out what they needed for sustenance. But these operators came in and would take everything. And so this was a bit of a lawless time. There's a few books and movies about it when they would fight over the so-called rights. And one of the native said that we used to never have to go anywhere for enough, but only in our own bay and streams. And now we have to run all over with gas boats to find fish because they've all been plucked out, and a lot of the areas were stripped clean of their return generation. And so there was a great collapse of it, which is one of the reasons why Alaska became a state in 1959 under President Eisenhower, so there would be federal and state control over these private canneries, which were just sort of like the Wild West out here. The U.S. Navy actually came in and tried to impose what they call the common property for fishing, so that they would differentiate around, but above all, prevent wholesale wipeout of the fish. So this is the whole problem around the world and in Alaska. You get enough efficient fishing boats and you know the science, you know where they are, then it's very easy to take too much, especially with modern gill netting and seine fishing that can take just about everything that's in there. And this is where the conservation and preservation of the industry has been a rolling debate forever now, so that the seasons, depending on the species, can be just a few weeks rather than all the year. Various stocks like the herring run have collapsed pretty much completely. The salmon are pretty healthy, but again, it depends on how much you take versus what gets away. So the average, let's say, salmon that comes out of a stream, there were about 2 out of 2,000 that survived to come back to roost, and I mean to reproduce. And so there's plenty to take as long as you have enough that'll come back in. And so this is the rough life of the fishermen up here. Again, some of them are young, they just do it for a short season. They're always planning to do something else. But the pay is so good, you can earn $100,000 in a season. If you're a greenie, they call you, you're a new kid who has never done it, you just get a percentage of the take, you don't actually get paid. And then there's a lot of waste. The bycatch, let's say the leftovers are preyed upon by the birds. And a gentleman on board the other day was saying that he was fishing off of Icy Strait, which is a narrows near Glacier Bay, and as soon as they filled their nets and were heading into harbor, the whales would come and they would break through their nets, let all the fish go, gobble them all up, and they'd have to throw their nets away, making more debris on the bottom of the ocean. So they were always trying to get away from the whales that would take their catch. And this has resorted to some shooting at whales and things like that go on to this day. But the science has tried to understand what these individual species go to do. So they have fish finding, sonar, and other mapping techniques to see where they're spawning, where they feed, how many they are then, so they can predict their size. This is a little smelt, a little sardine version of a salmon and alewife. They have many different names, and then they'll burgeon into a big cloud and they'll become feed for other animals in the sea, particularly the larger whales and seals. There are little sand flukes all through the shallows here that live in the sand and pop up. Those are numerous and again a feedstock. Here's a black cod, and that's often what you get on a menu now because there's no more Atlantic cod in the commercial sense. So there's a lot of the cod you see nowadays is a specialty that comes from Alaskan or Arctic waters. And then there's the pollock, which is the most common by weight of all the fish. It's out in the Bering Sea. It doesn't come into the streams. It's a ground feeding and migratory ocean fish, not very big or distinctive, except it comes in such giant schools that this is where the industrial trawlers go out and they will scoop them all up in their vast seine nets like this. So this is the largest single cash industry of the fishings in Alaska, and it's had a lot of criticism because they just take so much, but it is the the usual thing that you get when you think you're buying crab meat or whitefish or fish and chips and things like that. They often will process it on the ship or else come in and have freezing setups. But almost any whitefish you see on the market is often pollock from Alaska. So this has been, for the last couple of decades, the big boom production fish, but it's also had years where there was hardly any. So this is where these monster industrial fishers go out there and scoop it all up and then come back next year. You wonder why there are no more fish. Well, you had a good year last year. That's the debate, which means that the fishing life is unreliable and also very dangerous with fires and collisions and snowstorms and all this trouble, and is considered one of the most hazardous professions on earth other than being a successful rock and roll musician. And so in the harbors of Alaska, you have blessings of the fleet, just like you do in Gloucester, Massachusetts. So it was a profession where people would go out and just not come back, like you can see in many a movie. But nonetheless, many small vessels go out, and what they've done is limit the size of the vessel for the inland waters. And so some are out there in the middle of the Bering Sea, bigger vessels, but in all these harbors you see these gatherings of smaller fish. And I mean, smaller boats, so I think the regulation now for a purse seiner is 52 feet, and that means you can only have maybe 5, 6 crew, and you can only go so far. So just by limiting the size of the vessels, then you distribute it that, and then every family has a boat, and then the season they go out and get what they need. So there's sort of a regulation just by default that way. And you've seen these in the harbor, Juneau, they're right there. These are the punters that go out and drop the nets out and gather them out and then drag them in. And so this is let's say, a rough life that, some people would never do, except that it is a livelihood in a fast cash up here, which is sort of important. So here's the old story in Alaska is that the fishing towns, there were about 4 men to every 1 woman, and the saying is that for the women the odds are good, but the goods are odd. And to the men they say, if you're still married, you haven't been fishing enough. And there's another saying here which is, fish hard, sleep is overrated. But this is what it can do to your hands, so it's considered not a happy profession. But again, the old story is the fisherman comes back and he's reeking of fish, and another woman says, how can you stand the smell of that man? And she says, he smells like money. And so if you bear with me on this, there's an Alaskan story of a chain letter. You remember letters? Remember chain letters? Well, here's the fisherman's letter. Dear friend, 1/4 of the earth's surface is water, and only 1/4 is land. And the good Lord's intention is very clear. A man's time should be divided, 3/4 for fishing and 1/4 for work, and a little bit of time at home. And this chain has been started in the hope of bringing you happiness and fortune as a fisherman. And unlike most chains, it does not require money. Simply send a copy of this to 5 fishermen friends, then bundle up your wife and send her to the fellow whose name is at the top of the list. And when your name reaches the top of the list, you'll receive 16,268 women, and some of them should be keepers. Have faith, don't break the chain. One man broke it, and he got his wife back. My pardon for the fishing women out there. But anyway, this is a rough life that we all appreciate because it's on our dinner menu. So the real problem is all this regulation that keeps it going. So there's local, state, federal, and international regulations depending on the species, especially out in the Bering Sea, where the U.S. Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard have cooperative patrols to keep the Asian fleet out. And so depending on the species, it's either up or down, but particularly in the salmon department, all of the West Coast salmon fisheries in the south, meaning south of British Columbia, have all collapsed. There's hardly anything from California to British Columbia, which were historically the biggest runs, and now the only remnant is left in Alaska. And even up here, depending again on the specific place and the species, it's been in general decline. And so this is where there's a kind of a compulsion we have to understand this to be able to protect what we have still and have still a harvest. Also way up in the Arctic now, they've been fishing for longline and seine up there now that the ice has been breaking up. And so one of the, when I say the worst job on earth, is to be a fishery inspector, because the state puts inspectors on all of the larger ships. And so the deck can get awfully slippery up there, I imagine. So most famously are the crab cakes. I mean, the crab takes up here, the show The Deadliest Catch and all this. So there are a number of varieties: spider, tanner, brown crabs, and the giant king crab. And so they're pretty lovely little creatures. And only another crab would think that's a cute face again. But they're incredible demons of the sea, and they get so big that the king crab is what we had for lunch here today, and it's quite remarkable if they let them grow to their size. So the season is very tightly controlled, and they will go out only when they are finished mating and they finish spawning. So here's an intimate view of a couple of crabs down on the bottom of the Bering Sea. But what they do at the certain season is they make it what they call a great ball, where they all gather and they all roll around like a big party. And it used to be that the crabbers with their sensors could see where the balls were, and then they'd net the whole thing up. And then there would be no more crabs in that patch of the ocean forever again. And so this is where, again, even the crabbers were, where they put this incredible effort and investment in machinery, and the highly paid fishermen to go out there, drop their pots out there. And this is in the winter they do this, in the Bering Sea, where it's only maybe even light about an hour or two a day. And then they work all the time tending a patch that they've leased. And they have to put up with the terrible weather, and the icing of the ship in particular is dangerous, because the whole fishing vessel can just roll over if it's overloaded. So this is why they made that ever dramatic TV series. But this is a sustainable catch, supposedly, because it still continues after all these years. We still have some. But again, the problem is the bycatch. They're often pulling up things, and they also have a problem that they've noted is they call ghost traps, which means the crab pot will be dropped down, but the wire will get broken in handling, and the pot will be down there with bait in it, and then the crabs will get in it, and then more will get in it, and then they'll find it all full of dead crabs, and no more can get in it. So now the state regulation is one side of a crab pot must be so flimsy that they can break out of it if it gets too full and not just kill all the population. Well, anyway, this is the toil of the sea, and it's in various parts of the world there are certain species that are doing well, like blue crabs. I live on the Hudson River, where we have a lot of them, and they're not allowed to be fished commercially, so you can go out and catch them any day. And of course, we have these on the menu and appreciate it. But I'll tell you another fisherman's story. A couple of guys go out in their local boat and are fishing, and blow comes over. The boat goes over. One of them swims ashore to go and get his buddy rescued, and then the rescue comes down, and they call him up and they say, "Well, we have bad news and we have good news. Well, your buddy didn't make it. He's down 15 feet, all tangled in seaweed and rocks. But the next time we go out to see him, you get half of the crab catch." Anyway, here's the boat that they made this movie, or rather the TV series. They did a whole setup to build a crab boat that was also a film set. And they ran this out of Ketchikan, where they had a little theater, and they would do this. This boat actually rolled over and sank recently. But they made a kind of a bully image out of the crabman. But then I'm going to just talk about the salmon. Now, you've already seen some. They are the 5 major species, and the old mnemonic was the thumb is the chum, and the sockeye is this finger, the king is that one, the silver is your other finger, and the pinky is the pink salmon. So you sort of remember there are 5 species that they have their own life and they don't mingle. They come up the same stream at a different time of year. So here's the silver. When they go red, that's when they're inflamed to go back up to their spawning screen. Sockeye, Then there's one that is a Dolly Varden, which is a semi-freshwater fish. It mostly stays up in the stream and is named after a Dickens character after her calico suit with the red spots. Then you have coastal trout, and again, that goes into the sport fishing. But the lifestyle of the salmon is just sort of unbelievable because they will be born in a stream in a little rocky nest. They will live in that, become little fry and alewife, and then they go out to sea in about a year, and then they spend 2 to 5 years out in the ocean, and they feed and get bigger, and then they come all the way back to their home stream through a miracle of either magnetic detection and or chemical sensors of smelling the minerals in the home stream. And so they will come back up after all these years and fight their way up the stream. This is Ketchikan Creek with the old Creek Street saloons over it. And this at a time will be just covered with fish. You can't see it here. They're in the water, so they just look like, there's so many, they just look like rocks. And then they beat themselves up, the ladders or the rocks themselves, up into the flatter land where their spawning ground is. And occasionally there are bears to catch them. People take a certain harvest of them, but in this case there's an actual native run salmon hatchery up there. So they've been helping them along and rebuilding the stock so that they'll always have them coming up. And so when they get into the flat kind of stream like this with the heavy foliage, this is where they will mingle around. They will find their nest with rocks and sort of build it. Here on Ketchikan Creek, they have weirs. They put them in a certain area so that they won't be disturbed or washed away. And then they can take them in and process them. And then the fish will spray their eggs and their milt, it's called, for the males, and then it just mingles in the water and fertilizes all these little eggs that start to grow all over the place. And then the parents roll over and die with a big smile on their face. So this is a great miracle of nature. Why would these fish spend their whole life wanting to go back home to where they came from? I mean, can you imagine going back to where you were born just to, well, I don't know what you do there, but so this is where they call it the fish that dies for love. And so then they decompose, and this is an important fact because they will fertilize the stream such that there's some 120 species from little bugs to other fish to the trees, and then the other animals that will be nourished by the great die-off of the salmon. And recently some of them have been coming back with this. This one I took a picture in Skagway the other week with, there's a white fungus on this salmon, and that is an indication that it was overheated and it may not have gone up to actually spawn. It died on the way because now they're succumbing to the rising temperatures in both the ocean and the streams. And so that's put a lot of focus on the hatcheries, like here in Ketchikan, where they want to make sure they keep producing enough ones that will either evolve a bit and they'll be tougher in the future generations, but we don't know. So far, the stocks have held. This is in Sitka. I don't know if anybody walked down the road to see this hatchery there, where they took one of the streams and they channelized it, and then they have tubs where they put the fish they catch, they sort them out. Certain ones they would just release to go back. Then they will take them and they'll process them by taking out the roe and taking out the milt, and then they'll mix it just in a big bucket, and so that's all fertilized eggs. And so the chances of this surviving versus just being eaten by the bugs and the other fish is considerably improved, and therefore they'll just put them into other tanks and raise them to the point where they'll have many thousands of them ready to just release in the same creek, and then in so many years they'll come back. And so this has meant that wild salmon in Alaska has continued to be a sustainable harvest and of course, a top shelf commodity around the world because it's illegal to farm salmon in Alaska. They pride themselves that all salmon from Alaska is wild, even if it was born in a hatchery. And so this is the pride of the state. They even have flying salmon. And you know you can get fresh salmon delivered from Alaska to your doorstep, and that's sort of one of those things that sort of jumped over the other freezing and canned salmon. But of course, this year there were problems, so that now the fish have to wear masks and have socially distancing in the stream. So what's a poor fish going to do? And if you talk to any of the local fishermen, they're particularly angry at the farm salmon from British Columbia to Norway to Chile, because they say those are all cardboard fish. They've been penned in. They have antibiotics. They have to add color to them so they don't look gray, because they're actually not real fish, they will say. So this is the motto there: don't let friends eat farm salmon. And there's this local Ketchikan artist named Roy Troll, who is a fisherman and a graphic artist. So I'll just ask your forbearance. He makes T-shirts now, so you might have seen some of these, because he's sort of the local cartoonist. But fish are not for farming. Salmon, the fish that dies for love. Fish and chips. And here's one for the musicians, the Bateful Dead. And psychedelic. Well, you can see what else they do around here. Here's a new movie, Return of the Sockeye. So it's a long winter. This guy draws all the time when he's not fishing. Then he runs a rock and roll band called the Jammin' Salmon or the Rat Wailers or something like this. So here's this new album called Fish Worship. And so I'll play it if you want. We didn't have time on the inside. But anyway, that's a little of the local culture. But then there's some real major battles on the immediate, let's say, policy level. You may have read about the Pebble Mine, which would be the world's biggest gold mine, up to the west of Anchorage in an area it's a wilderness, and there's actually no inhabitants at all, because it's mostly lakeland, and then there's strings of volcanoes around. Also, there are earthquakes all the time, but it's a lush land of lowland streams, and this is the largest salmon production area in all of Alaska, and they come from Bristol Bay and the Bering Sea up here, and this is many more times anything that's in the southeast where we have been. So this sort of myriad of streams means that there's the biggest hatchery of salmon in the world. And if this plan it was originally Rio Tinto, along with Anglo-American Mining and Mitsubishi, other environmental groups, were going to make a mine this size with the trailings and the runoff. Well, this got all of the fishermen and then all of the native peoples who have subsistence fishing just completely opposed to it. And it's been in the Alaskan state government. It was approved by the federal government. The Army Corps of Engineers changed their mind, and currently it's still held up because there'll be no going back. And so here's one of the anti-mine advertising. That's what you'll need to go fishing after that is done. And so this is a lifestyle, a livelihood, and also a constant controversy about what can we really do. And of course, people come up here for the pleasure of it. And even in no matter what the weather. Now again, who caught who here? And here I was fishing with my old friend Sarah Palin once. But here's another saying they have up here. If you believe you can tell me where to fish, I believe I can tell you where to go. Just a modest proposition. And so rather than thinking you're going to go elsewhere, you end up in heaven as a fisherman up here. And so this is a delight for those of us who come up just for the fun of it, or it's a good meal for the rest of us. And so here's my last saying of it, this old Latin saying from the Mediterranean, pescarare quadmentire, which means I fish, therefore I lie. And so again, the story is a fisherman comes back, and he doesn't go home to see his wife and kids. He goes out drinking, and then he meets some girl, and he spends the night with her. And he comes staggering in at dawn, and the wife's standing there, and where have you been? He said, well, I've been drinking, and I found this new woman in town, and but no, don't lie to me. You've been fishing all night long. And with that, I wish you happy fishing, and my pleasure to sail with you. Thank you very much.